shit!
This is going to be your ultimate guide, walking you through every step in the important information you're going to need to know with making your first miniature. First things first, I'm going to be using Warhammer 40k miniatures for this demonstration. There's two reasons for that. First, Warhammer, let's be honest, is the most popular tabletop war game in existence.
Hell yeah, let's do some 40k. What is that?
You don't know Warhammer 40k?
Oh yeah, Warhammer 40k, of course. I'm down, let's do it.
Type geekiest thing would have to be my Warhammer.
It's funny you say the pittances thing. So like in Warhammer 40k Dark Tide.
Secondly, that's what my channel's mainly focused around. Even if we stick to Games Workshop, there are a bunch of other different kinds of miniatures. You have the fantasy version of Warhammer with Age of Sigmar. Then you have games like Horus Heresy, which is a prequel to Warhammer 40k and is much more of a sci-fi historical setting. If you want even more historical of a setting, you have Old World, which is another version of Warhammer Fantasy, but is also a prequel. These are not just limited to war games, you also have skirmish games like Kill Team and Warcry, which are both sci-fi and fantasy respectively. On top of that, you have more RPG style games such as Necromunda and the literal Warhammer RPG. These techniques you're going to be learning will apply to all of these settings. You just have to pick the one you want and follow through with it. Additionally, these skills are going to just be applicable to any miniature you guys want to learn to paint. Every miniature is going to be slightly different and it's going to take a slightly different process. So I'm going to walk you through the basics, and once you understand the basics, you're going to be able to approach any miniature without any concern. First things first, we're going to talk about what these miniatures are made of. Now, Games Workshop arguably has some of the best plastics in the world. You're not going to exclusively run into plastics in the miniature painting hobby. Commonly, it used to be almost all lead or white metal. Now everything has made the shift to resin or plastic. Resin is a different form of plastic that is going to be much more of a difficult process to handle. A lot of your Forge World miniatures are going to be resin, which takes a different set of skills. But your most common miniature is these plastic miniatures. This is another reason why I'm choosing to use them. Now, technically, with resin and with plastic, you should wash your miniatures.
Connection terminated. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Elizabeth, if you still even remember that name, but I'm afraid you've been misinformed.
But, in reality, I've only really found you need to wash resin miniatures. I've almost never in my life ever washed a plastic miniature. Technically, they are using release agents that you should be washing off. And these release agents will stick to these miniatures and will prevent your primer from sticking to your miniature. Now that you've selected your miniature, we can move to the next step. Removing the miniature from the sprue. This is going to be a relatively straightforward process. Most of us start with pushing them out of the sprue, but that's not really what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to cut them out. Famously, I tried to use kitchen scissors to cut out some of my first models. That is definitely not what you want to do. What you're going to want to remove these miniatures from the sprue is something that's referred to as a clipper. These actually look like wire cutters. Now, you can technically use wire cutters, but clippers are more specialized and it's going to be a lot easier than using a wire cutter, so might as well use the specialized tool if you're going to spend the money. There's a plethora of companies that produce these within a range of many different qualities. I started with Citadel clipper, and despite the stereotype of them kind of sucking, I pretty much used them exclusively for my first 2 years, until I started to get more into 3D printing. When they give you 3D printers, they usually include clippers, and I found these clippers that they were including to be much nicer. I've also found out, as I've done more research into these clippers, these are the same type of clippers Gunpla is using. So don't be afraid to look at other hobbies within the miniature space and see what they're doing and learning from them. Now, when you're clipping miniatures off, I tend to tell people to try to keep all the parts segmented. You don't want to just clip them all off at once. You want to follow the instructions to the kit. That's also why I use these medicine pill bottles. What I'll do is I'll cut out the whole miniature and put them all in the pill bottle. That way I have each one segmented off so I know which one is what. Now, when clipping them from the sprue, there is some debate on where you should do it. A lot of people say you should cut away from the tab and leave a little bit of the sprue on the miniature so you come back and clean it, therefore you don't cut in too deep accidentally. I have never in my life accidentally cut in too deep. I've never had any issues with that before, so I don't do that. But I did want to tell you that people do this just in case you have any issues running into it. Personally, I tend to clip and then I'll run my hobby knife along the clipping edge to make sure to flatten it out. Also, as sprue lines, there's a plethora of different names for that, but these are all residual plastic left over from the casting process. Thus, we have to try to remove them as modelers to make it look more realistic. Now, this can be done one of two ways. This can be done through the use of sandpaper or sandpaper sticks, or with the back of your hobby knife. Now, Citadel does produce special tools to deal with this, but I find those tools are really sucky because it's basically just a piece of metal that you rub, and I can do the same thing with my knife that's a better quality than they can produce. But you have to remember, Citadel produces stuff that's targeted to younger people. That may be good for younger people, but as an advanced hobbyist, it's not good for me. So I just use a hobby knife, and then I start the assembly process according to the instructions. Here comes another thing where you have to choose. Games Workshop produces glue that are meant for these miniatures that's essentially just plastic cement. What a plastic cement is just taking the two pieces of plastic, melting it so they weld together. They're not the only company to do this, and their glue is massively overpriced. So, I personally use Tamiya Extra Thin. This is something that's famous within the Gunpla community and the bolt action community. This I can get for a lot cheaper, but does not give as targeted application of the plastic cement as the Citadel does. But I don't have the issues with my bottle clogging, and I don't have to pay a lot of money for it. However, there is more than just plastic cement. Technically, super glue is an option, but it's really not advised for plastics. And this is because super glue doesn't weld the pieces together, it just holds the pieces together. The reason why I bring this up is if you're working with resin, you can't use the plastic cement. It's not the right type of plastic, you are forced to use super glue. The same thing with the white metal miniatures is you have to use super glue with those. You have no other option. Now, there is some debate on which super glues you should use. I personally prefer the Gorilla Glue Super Gel. I find it gives me a bit of time to work, but holds a really tight, strong bond. But you might accidentally rub some of the paint off of your miniatures from the oils in your hand if you're not using them. But a lot of them are massively overpriced. Even the nice ones are massively overpriced. So what I do, because I'm a raging alcoholic, is I take wine cork bottles as my handle holders. This is a very old common thing within the historicals community when they're painting up miniatures. All I do is I take my drill bit and I drill a hole into their foot, and then I take a piece of thin metal wire with super glue, put it into the foot, let it dry, and then use that to put it to the wine cork. This is a very simple and easy process. It also helps me to do sub-assembly. Now, primer is something that's kind of an interesting topic because many people are going to give you many different thoughts, and there's many different ways to prime. But if this is your first miniature, I often advise people to just use Citadel.
Get this man a can of Citadel primer.
Citadel is overpriced, but their primers are excellent and really good. Now, Colorforge, Rust-Oleum, a bunch of other places like Vallejo do produce primers, and they are excellent. But those are all not fast-drying primers. Citadel is the only one that's a fast-drying primer, so you'll be able to get it done within 10-20 minutes and get immediately into your painting process, where when I was doing tests with Vallejo, it took up to an hour to fully dry. I do have a YouTube short on my channel that goes into depth about priming, and 9 times out of 10, you're going to prime right, so there's really no worrying about this. So what I would advise you to do is to just pick one particular paint starter set, whether that be Vallejo, Army Painter, or Citadel, or even Monument Hobbies. Work with that and slowly start adapting other paints from other brands into that kit as you go on this journey. The one advantage that Citadel and Army Painter have over other brands is they have a thing called contrast and speed paints. These are designed for people who are less experienced with paints to paint easier. They're super thin and add automatic contrast into your painting, creating dark points and light points within the miniature naturally. Working with normal paints don't create this effect. Working with normal paints will not create this effect. However, I oftentimes advise against using these while starting, as they are traditionally proposed. If you follow the traditional way of using these, or as the way the companies portray, you will not grow as a painter. You will not learn certain techniques that are essential to grow as a painter, and these will just become a crutch for you. However, as you keep going in the hobby and you want to try new things, including them in your arsenal is always advised. Like any other tool, it can be used both positively and negatively. Personally, I work with a mix of paints, as you can see. I have 2 of these things from Citadel, and then 2 of them from Monument Hobby. And this is where you're going to run into another distinct, unique thing about miniature painting, is the bottles. These bottles tend to be different depending on what company's bottles you're going to be using. First of all, the most popular bottle you're going to see is not necessarily the best bottle, and that's Citadel. These are using a paint pot design. However, most other companies in the world use what is an eyedropper design. According to interviews done by the creators at Citadel, they created these pots and designed them specifically for new people coming into the hobby, so you wouldn't need to have a palette to paint. Now, the weird thing about this is you're supposed to thin your paints when you're painting with them, which necessitates having a palette. So why you would design a bottle that doesn't need a palette when you have to use a palette, it is confusing as hell. However, you don't have to worry about the issues you do with eyedropper bottles, where oftentimes the paint will dry in the tip, forcing you to take a needle or something else to try to remove it from the tip. Or you blow the lid off your bottle and you throw it across the room. I definitely didn't have that happen to me in the middle of Adepticon. When you're first starting out, James Workshop is going to give you these weird paper palettes that essentially is the same thing as a hard plastic palette. Personally, I do not like either of these. I find my paint dries super fast, and I find that it's rather annoying to use. However, using them for washes, inks, and other stuff like that, where I'm using highly liquidy paints, or even contrast paints, works far better in these. For traditional paints, I prefer what is known as a wet palette. There's a plethora of companies that produce wet palettes. Personally, I think the best is Redgrass Games. However, Army Painter does produce some really good palettes that oftentimes are much more user-friendly than anybody else on the market. Specifically, a few of the bigger Army Painter paints come with speed paint holders and other ways to use traditional paints built into it, so you don't have to necessarily choose which one you want when you buy one of those from Army Paint. After I've primed these guys, they're perfectly ready to paint. So what I've done is, before I paint those, I'm going to use this pink paint and show you some of the more traditional processes that you're going to be using. This is going to be things like the standard edge method from Games Workshop, then the volumetric method that is very popular, and then a dry brushing / sponging method that you can do to paint miniatures. These three methods are going to allow you to paint any color you want in this hobby. Now let's start with the first way of doing it, and this is more of the box art way of doing it. First thing you're going to do is put your paint out of your paint pot, and then you're going to want to thin your paint. Now each paint is going to need a different consistency of thinning to get a different result, but what you want to do is add 2 thin coats to base the whole miniature. This is going to provide a much more unified coverage. The next thing you're going to do is a rough edge highlight. These are wrapping around the sides, and then after that you're going to provide another crisp, thick edge highlight, and that's how you achieve the heavy method. The heavy metal method. These are everything you've seen on the box art. That's the style they've done. And the reason why this is done that way is it's because Heavy Metal is the name of their painting studio. However, this is one of the hardest painting styles, and quite honestly, I don't think it sells the effect the best. That's why I often tell people to try other painting techniques when they're first starting. This is why I almost exclusively recommend dry brushing to people who are starting off. Now, dry brushing is a bit trickier because it's become super popular recently, therefore a bunch of people are preaching bad techniques. First of all, you're not going to be using a dry brushing palette. Dry brushing palettes will make your things look actually chalkier because when you're painting on exposed plastic that hasn't been primed, it's going to dry your paints out much faster because they're porous. So, if you want to have the best dry brush, you have to have some moisture in your brush. Personally, I do prefer a little drier than most, but you do still want some liquid there to move the pigment, because if you don't, you're not going to be moving the pigment well. Thus, the argument for kitchen towel or paper towel being used is also bad, because it's going to absorb all the stuff in your paint. However, this comes to the crucial step. What you can do is take either a really, really light damped rag, or a rag in general. Using that will make sure it doesn't remove all the liquid from your paint and keep your paint wet. Dry brushing is one of the easiest and one of my most recommended techniques for a beginner, but it's not the only way. And you'll find that a lot more advanced painters will use a completely different technique, which is called volumetric highlighting. Volumetric highlight refers to volume, and it's a very easy way to understand how to paint miniatures, but is a very hard way to do it, because it's the same technique that you use for non-metallic metals. It's understanding how light bends around circular objects. As you can see now, I've put the 3 techniques together, and they've all created somewhat of the same effect. You're having shadows, you have midtones, and you have highlights. For these guys, I specifically used an airbrush, but if you've watched my old video of how to paint yellow, you'll see you can do the same thing with rattle can, where I've used a pink undercoat to give it a nice rich dark undertone, and then use a zenithal highlight, referring to highlighting it from its zenith. I used a zenithal highlight with a contrast paint. This is why I oftentimes say contrast paints are difficult for beginners, because it takes an advanced painter to know how to use them. Because Citadel is going to tell you just prime it in white, cover it in the contrast paint, and you should be good as new. That's not going to give you an interesting color, it's going to look flat. if you put a different color under it and then use white as your highlight, you have pre-built-in highlights, and then you can just put the paint onto the miniature and add an interesting tone that looks like these transitions that you're going to be doing with these traditional paints. With the yellow finished and base coated, I can now move on to other parts of the miniature. I'm going to now focus on the black because it's the next hardest color to paint. I used black with a base coat. Base coated black so I know my shadows will look dark. Then, instead of picking a white, I just decided to pick a bluish gray. This is going to add more visual interest, starting with a thick highlight covering about 90%, leaving the shadows. Then I went back with a brighter color and layered that on with a mid-tone. Then I did a semi-light tone with a tight edge highlight, finishing this off with another tight edge highlight with my brightest color that was mixed with white. This will give it the sharpness that an edge highlight needs, but will give me a full spectrum of the 5 colors. Now that we've finished the black, we can move on to the pink. And the pink is going to use a much more dry brush style. I'm starting with a base coat of the pink. This needs to be a darker pink, and then I'm going to add what is referred to as non-oil. Oftentimes people refer to this as cheat juice, and it's not really that. What it is it seeps into the cracks and makes everything darker, but oftentimes it's more like a stain than it is a wash, because a wash will just get into the cracks and stay there. This stains the parts it touches, so it makes everything darker. And that's what I want, because I want a darker shade of this pink for my shadows, but I don't have that in my arsenal. Thus, I decided to do what I did. After that, I came back and dry brushed the mid-tone again, following this up with another dry brush of my pink. This is because the pink is rather thin, therefore I needed to complete 2 full dry brushes before I include a lighter pink into the mixture. Mixing this with about a 50-50 mix gives me a good mid-tone. Then I decided to use straight pink for Monument Hobbies. Now, this is rather difficult paint to dry brush, so I decided to use it in a much smaller area, allowing the dry brush to work much better than what it had been doing. Finishing off with almost a mixture of pure white in this higher pink for Monument Hobbies, with a very, very small dry brush / edge highlight. As you can see, it was a super quick process and why dry brushing is so easy for beginners. While walking through this miniature with me, you're going to see how referencing every single one of these traditional painting methods will make you a better painter. 1. I started with volumetric highlights with my yellow. Secondly, I used traditional heavy method with my blacks. And finally, with my pinks, I used more of a dry brushing technique with them. Having used all of these methods left me open to just applying metallics now. Now, there's a bunch of tricks to apply metallics, and I can get into that in a further video, but as a beginner, you just want to treat metallics like metallics. And I often tell people to use metallics at the end. This is because metallics have metal flakes in them when you clean out your brush in your water and then use it to then paint another paint, you will get the metallic flakes that was in this metal paint now in all of your paint because they're in your brush. Thus, if you do it at the end, you don't have to worry about changing out your water. Furthermore, you tend to have, especially within Warhammer miniatures, metal as an accent color. Very few armies, except for specific ones like the Grey Knights, don't really have most of their armor being metallic. It tends to be painted and then metallics on top of that. Now comes one of the most important steps to me personally, and it brings miniatures to life, and this is water slide transfers. I have dysgraphia, so oftentimes it's hard for me to freehand things because my hand is constantly shaking. Thus, using these water slide transfers will allow me to add a bunch of details to miniatures without having to freehand everything. It adds a lot of life to the miniatures, especially when we discuss things from like 40k, where these suits of armor are super ancient, therefore they should be covered in iconography, revered, and blessed constantly. But this is again a place where Games Workshop kind of fails, despite being the most popular brand out there. If you follow the techniques that they tend to say, I've often had more issues with water slide transfers, and I've seen more people refuse to use them because of this. So I'm going to walk through how to do decals, but I do have a YouTube short that already goes into detail of how to do decals. I'm just doing this to make sure this is comprehensive. So the first thing I do is I select the ones I want to add. Then I cut them out. I apply micro set. This is going to help remove it from the paper. While that is happening, I will come in with my miniature and put a gloss varnish on the parts of the miniature I want to be covered in decals. Doing this will allow it to easily slide and be moved around without removing any of those bottom layers of paint. Make sure your miniature is fully dry from the varnish. Then what you do is you take the transfer and you apply it to your miniature. Oftentimes I'll get it in place and then I'll add a little extra microset to make sure it's fully flattened. Now, for things like the Imperial Fist transfer that I'm using that are circles, this is oftentimes very hard to put on 360 or spherical objects. Thus, what I'll do is I'll add extra cuts into the cut that I've done to make sure it can fold on top of one another and makes much more of a smoother look than just applying it and having half of it sitting up, because Games Workshop can't make a circle fit on a sphere for some reason. Now, usually it takes about an hour to dry, but normally this is at the end of one of my painting sessions, so I tend to leave the transfers overnight to make sure they're fully dry. Then I'll come back the next day and hit it with micro salt. This is going to make the transfers look like they're painted on. So the last time I painted miniatures, it took me about 3 rounds of the microsol to get the painted on effect look. My YouTube short goes into much more depth about this, explaining a bunch more things about it, but that's the general gist. Now, this is where you have 1 or 2 options. You can just varnish this guy, then base him and be done, or you can do what I'm going to do and add a bit more weathering to it to make it look much more battle-worn. I'm going to be doing that through sponge chipping, which is a rather simple process that's actually stolen from the model train community. What I do is I take a piece of sponge, rip a small part of it off, and then depending on what colors I'm using, if I'm using a very bright color, I'm using brown. If I'm using a darker color, I'm going to use black. And it's going to help sell a chipping effect. I'm going to run this paint, essentially like a dry brush or a sponge, along the sharp edges in the most areas that are going to have wear and tear, applying just a thin amount of paint to sell this as small chips. Now, for characters, I tend to come back with a brush and apply a silver paint. For field troops, you can then just come back with a smaller portion of the sponge and then apply the silver. But it looks better if you target in the chips that you've just previously made with that brown or black to sell this chipping effect that the paint has been chipped off and it shows the under metal. With this and pigmenting, it adds a lot of character to the miniature and makes it look grounded and realistic. Now, when it comes to basing, this is a video that could be itself. Basing is a very complicated topic, but what I will say is I would tell you to base your miniatures, because even an excellently painted miniature will not look as good without a base. And if you paint a bad miniature, it looks better if you have a base on it. You can make a generic base like I did, because the goal of this army was to fit a generic look, or you can use more specialized bases, stuff like you might see for Necromunda or big heroic bases. But remember, the bigger the base, the more effort you have to put in. What I decided to do is simulate some of the box art because this is a beginner tutorial video. What I did is I just put a texture paint on miniatures. I made sure to wipe the rim so none of the texture paste would get onto the rim, so it has a clean rim look. And then I just painted it using the same dry brushing method we've done with a bunch of layers of brown. Personally, I find Gamer's Grass to be some of the best grass tufts that you can find on the market, and they have a bunch of tutorials of how to texture bases to make them look realistic. They even have a whole beginner set, which I have bought like 3 of them because they have so much stuff in it that's just really good and nice. But I did technically apply more grass tufts to them, so it doesn't really look like a GW base. But personally, I really like adding more grass tufts because oftentimes grass tufts, unless you're in the desert, don't grow singularly, they grow in patches. And then I always finish with a black rim job. With that, these heavy intercessors are complete and ready to go on the tabletop. Which means it's time for some sexy B-roll.
Which has determined your fate. I've never seen so clear. I feel the end and it's near. The day of reckoning's here. The sound of deafening fear. You don't die if you try. You just might get